today's hearing. This is a subject that I've spent a great deal of my career before coming to Congress working on, particularly in terms of federal investment and the way the federal government can support community and economic development. I mean, after all, the best way to provide for sustainable communities is to make sure that they have vibrant economies. And the federal government does have a role, can have a greater role, I think, in supporting that. Our states do rely on significant assistance from the federal government. The data that's been discussed in this committee makes that point very clear. But those state programs and state government's ability to be more stable allows states to invest in cities and towns as well. So reduced federal support has a cascading effect, not just on state budgets, but what we've seen is that states that are under fiscal stress tend to pass their stress on to local governments, which are creatures of state government. Add to that the reduction in the commitment that this federal government has made directly to community development through programs like, and Mr. Poloncarz, you mentioned the Community Development Block Grant Program. This is one of those programs where local priorities can drive funding decisions, but let's face it, I mean, we just haven't provided the support at a scale equal to the need in many of these communities. Those cuts in community development block grant support has a real impact on basic elements of civil society in chronically distressed communities. So perhaps Dr. Gordon and then Mr. Poloncarz, if you might discuss maybe in a little greater detail what you think the needs, CDBG being one way to address it, but in these left behind places, Dr. Gordon, that you referred to, these chronically distressed communities that seem to be immune to upcycles. There was a conversation about countercyclical investment. There are communities, a whole subset of American communities that are completely immune to upcycles. I happen to represent a string of those older industrial communities. I know you've all heard me talk about my hometown of Flint. It's the, I think the case study of what happens when we see chronic distress. Could you comment on where you think the federal government's role could be enhanced, each of you, particularly for these chronically distressed communities?
So I think the federal role is typically thought of as addressing these spillovers. So the congressman from New Jersey mentioned that you have bridges that connect states that people use every day to go from where they live to where they work. But there are also externalities from letting places fall behind. Not to mention that there is just a sense that as Americans, we want to provide a certain decent minimum for everyone, a certain level of access to goods that are necessary to live a healthy and productive life. So the federal government has a role in helping these places that are facing chronic challenges that come from things like trade and external economic events. One point that I tried to make in my testimony is that the federal government has an arsenal really at its disposal already in the $700 billion that it spends annually in federal grants, and that those grants could be better targeted to places that are in need. There have been experimentation during natural disasters, during economic disasters, to tweak these formulas to make them more responsive to differences in local need, in local cost, and local fiscal capacity. In my own work, I found that most states face a gap in what they could raise in revenues and what they would have to provide in spending to meet national benchmarks. Federal governments offset those gaps in about half of all states, but gaps remain in many, many states. And so from my perspective, I think the federal government should look at the tools that it already has and try to use them more effectively.
Poloncarz, you play a role in your community similar to one that I once played. I wonder if you might comment on the effect for your communities, but also the other places that you're familiar with around the state that may be facing chronic distress.
Well, the problem with chronic distress, Congressman, is it is chronic because you have just a never-ending cycle. You lose businesses, you lose tax base, you lose jobs, people move. What ends up happening, you still have the same need for the people that are left in the community, but you have less revenue now to pay for it on the local level. And we see that in large urban centers like the city of Buffalo, which has seen a tremendous revival, but depending on how you quantify it, it may be still considered the third or fourth poorest city in America. And then the same thing in rural communities where I talk to town supervisors, and they have some of the same issues and same problems. And on an annual basis, our consortium comes together to determine how we're going to spend community development block grants, and it's never enough. And we're then basically thinking, okay, what did we do last year? What did we do 2 years? Because we helped that community out 3 years ago. We helped this community out 2 years ago. Now who can we help out this year so that it's fair, but everyone sits at the table and just says we could do so much more if we had additional expenditure or additional revenue to assist us in those projects. And it really matters in a community where they cannot generate more revenue because they have a declining population and a declining tax base.
Thank you all very much, and I yield back.
The gentleman's time has expired. Now recognize the gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Norman, for 5 minutes.